There are places on this planet where the deeper science looks, the stranger reality becomes. Not legends, not internet myths, not blurry stories passed around because nobody checked the map. Real places, named places, places you can point to on Earth and say, it is right there. And yet the closer researchers get, the less certain everything feels. There is a waterfall with a fire burning behind it, a desert where rocks leave trails across the ground when no one is watching, a section of ocean where ships and aircraft have vanished into empty coordinates, a cave that swallows half a river and never seems to give anything back, lights that appear in the sky over the same valley year after year and still refuse to behave like anything science can neatly label. These places have been studied. Scientists have brought instruments, thermal cameras, geological surveys, satellite imagery, sonar, chemical analysis, radar, GPS, and decades of expertise. And in more than one case, the answer has not been certainty. It has been a pause, a theory, a partial explanation, a set of facts that still does not fully account for what people are seeing. That is what makes these places so unsettling. They are not mysterious because no one has looked. They are mysterious because people have looked very carefully and the questions are still standing. This is our countdown of the top 10 mysterious places on Earth science still can't explain. Stay until the end, because number 1 is a giant message carved into the Peruvian desert, so vast it only makes sense from the sky, created by people who had no known way to see it the way we see it now. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and what time it is right now. We want to see how many countries this mystery reaches tonight. Number 10, Eternal Flame Falls, New York, USA. Behind a small waterfall in Chestnut Ridge Park, there is a flame burning inside a shallow grotto of wet rock. At first glance, it feels like a trick, a tourist gimmick, a hidden gas line, something staged for photos. But the flame is real, and the explanation is where things become strange. Natural gas seeps do exist. Methane can leak through cracks in rock and under the right conditions, sustain an open flame. That part is not impossible. What makes Eternal Flame Falls mysterious is that the geological conditions beneath the site do not fit comfortably with the kind of gas seep scientists expected to find there. The shale below the area appears cooler and less geothermally intense than the environments normally associated with this kind of persistent methane release. In other words, the flame itself is not the mystery. The mystery is why the system feeding it exists there in the first place. Visitors hike down to the falls and see water dropping over stone, while just behind it, a small orange flame flickers in the darkness. Fire and water in the same place, coexisting in a way that looks wrong to the human eye. Sometimes the flame goes out and has to be relit. Sometimes it burns steadily, but the seep remains. The gas remains. And the geological story under the falls still feels incomplete. That incompleteness is exactly what earns this place a spot on the list. Because science has not failed here. Science has identified pieces of the process. It just has not fully resolved why the process looks the way it does in that exact location. And that distinction matters. A true mystery in the modern world is rarely a total blank. It is something worse. A place where we know enough to realize that the normal explanation does not fit as neatly as it should. Eternal Flame Falls is one of those places. The flame is small. The waterfall is modest. The site is easy to underestimate. Number 9, Devil's Kettle, Minnesota, USA. In Judge C.R. Magny State Park, the Brule River rushes toward Lake Superior through forest and rock, looking like any other cold northern river right up until the moment it splits in two. One side continues downstream like a normal waterfall. The other side disappears into a dark hole in the rock known as Devil's Kettle. That alone would be enough to make people stop. But the real mystery begins after the water vanishes. For decades, visitors and researchers ask the same question. Where does it go? The obvious answer seems simple. It must rejoin the river lower down or emerge somewhere else on its way to the lake. And yet tracing that path has never been as straightforward as common sense suggests it should be. People threw objects into the hole. They tried dye tests. They watched the flow below the falls. They compared water volume and searched for a visible outlet. Some studies have suggested that the missing water likely rejoins the river underground, which is the most reasonable explanation. but the path it takes remains hidden. The route is not visible. The underground geometry is not mapped in any satisfying way. And for a place that seems like it should have a clean answer, Devil's Kettle still feels strangely resistant to closure. That resistance is what keeps the mystery alive. Because when people stand there and watch half a river plunge into a hole in the rock, they are not just looking at disappearing water. They are looking at a failure of intuitive geography. Water is supposed to go somewhere you can imagine. Over a ledge, into a channel, into a lake, into a stream you can follow. Devil's Kettle interrupts that instinct. It replaces continuity with disappearance. The mind wants an opening, an exit, a visible reappearance. Instead, it gets sound, motion, and then absence. Geologists can tell you that underground channels through fractured basalt are not supernatural. And they are right. Number 8, Al Nasla Rock, Saudi Arabia. In the desert near Tama stands a sandstone formation that looks less like a natural rock and more like an object someone placed there as a test. The boulder is split almost perfectly in half by a narrow vertical gap, so clean and so precise that from many angles it appears machined. The two halves balance on natural stone bases, as if the entire formation should have collapsed long ago. It did not. That perfect split is the reason Al Nasla became famous. Natural rock breaks all the time, but natural fractures usually look chaotic. Jagged edges, irregular lines, broken surfaces that make geological sense even when they are dramatic. Al Nasla does not feel like that. It feels deliberate. The line is so straight that the human brain reaches for the same thought almost instantly. That cannot be natural. Geologists have proposed explanations. A natural joint in the sandstone, stress along a pre-existing line of weakness, weathering over time, possibly assisted by wind erosion and changes in temperature. All of these are plausible in isolation. The problem is visual. The formation looks too clean. That gap through the center has the aesthetic of design, and that is what makes it so powerful as a mystery. Because in many unexplained places, the evidence is messy. Here the evidence is too elegant. The rock seems to carry intention even though no convincing evidence of human cutting exists on the split itself. Ancient petroglyphs on the surrounding surfaces make the site even stranger. People were clearly aware of the formation thousands of years ago. They marked nearby stone. They lived in its presence. And that adds an almost mythic layer to the place because it suggests Al Nasla did not just look impossible to modern tourists. It likely looked impossible to ancient people too. The formation stands in open desert light, fully visible, with no cave, no underground chamber, no hidden mechanism to hide behind. Number 7, Hessdalen Valley, Norway. In a remote valley in central Norway, lights have appeared in the sky for decades. They have been seen hovering, drifting, flashing, accelerating, and changing color. Sometimes white, sometimes yellow, sometimes blue. They show up over the valley floor, above the hills, and at times seem to move in ways that make ordinary explanations feel too small. This is not a campfire story told by one witness on one strange night. The Hessdalen lights have been reported repeatedly since the early 1980s. They have been photographed, filmed, tracked, studied by researchers using radar, spectrum analysis, cameras, and measuring equipment. That detail matters, because the lights are not mysterious due to lack of observation. They are mysterious despite observation. Scientists have proposed several ideas: ionized dust or plasma, electrical discharges caused by local geology, interactions involving metallic minerals in the valley, a kind of natural battery effect produced by chemical and geological conditions. Some of these theories may account for part of the phenomenon. None has fully closed the case. And that gap between theory and certainty is what makes Hessdalen so fascinating. People want unexplained lights to become one of two things: either obvious misidentifications or full science fiction. But the reality here is more frustrating and more interesting than either option. The lights appear real enough to be measured, physical enough to register, persistent enough to justify long-term study, and irregular enough to keep refusing a clean label. If the valley were empty of data, the mystery would feel smaller. But that is not what happened here. Researchers built observation projects. They kept watching. They got results. And still, decades later, Hessdalen remains one of those places where science can describe behavior without being fully comfortable naming the cause. That creates a rare kind of modern mystery, not ancient. Number 6. Catatumbo Lightning, Venezuela. There is a place on Earth where the sky seems unable to stop firing. At the southwestern corner of Lake Maracaibo, near the mouth of the Catatumbo River, lightning erupts with such frequency and such consistency that for centuries people treated it like a natural lighthouse. Night after night, season after season, storm cells build in the same region and unleash extraordinary electrical activity. From a distance, the sky pulses again and again over the lake, bright enough to illuminate clouds, water, and horizon in repeated flashes. It does not look like ordinary weather. It looks like the atmosphere is stuck in a loop. Meteorologists do have partial explanations. Warm, moist air from the Caribbean and the lake basin meets cooler air descending from surrounding mountains. The geography helps trap and recycle the ingredients for instability. The region's heat, humidity, and wind patterns make it especially favorable for sustained thunderstorm development. That explains why the area gets lightning. It does not fully explain why it gets so much of it, so consistently, over the same general zone, with such unusual persistence. That is where the mystery remains. Catatumbo lightning is not unexplained in the childish sense of no one having ideas. It is unexplained in the more serious sense that the broad ingredients are known, but the total intensity and reliability of the phenomenon still feel extreme compared to similar environments elsewhere on Earth. Some researchers have suggested methane from surrounding wetlands or petroleum-rich zones may influence atmospheric conductivity. Others think the answer lies mostly in topography and local air circulation. The likely truth may be a combination of interacting factors, but the system remains distinctive enough that it continues to stand apart globally. And visually, few mysteries are more dramatic. You can imagine a lost city, a hidden cave, an ancient ruin. Number 5, Zone of Silence, Mexico. In the Chihuahuan Desert of northern Mexico, there is a region long associated with strange interruptions in communication. It is called the Zone of Silence, and its reputation comes from repeated claims that radios fail, signals weaken, and navigational equipment behaves unpredictably inside parts of the area. Like many mysterious places, the Zone of Silence exists in that dangerous middle ground where folklore, anecdote, and genuine anomaly overlap. That makes it difficult to study and even harder to summarize honestly. What is clear is that the region became famous after stories of disrupted transmissions and unusual behavior from equipment, and those stories were amplified by its remoteness, harsh desert landscape, and curious association with meteorite falls. Over time, the place accumulated a mythology of dead radios, strange lights, odd magnetic effects, and a sense that normal electromagnetic behavior weakens there. Skeptics argue much of the legend has been exaggerated. They may be right, but places do not usually gain this level of enduring reputation without something feeding the story. The real question is not whether every dramatic claim is true. It is whether there are enough recurring irregularities in the area to justify why the legend refuses to die. Some researchers have pointed to local concentrations of magnetic minerals or geological conditions that may interfere with certain transmissions under specific circumstances. That sounds reasonable. The problem is that reports from the region often feel inconsistent. Sometimes devices work, sometimes they do not. Sometimes the interference seems location-based, sometimes it seems temporary. The behavior is described less like a fixed property and more like an unstable condition. That instability is exactly what keeps the Zone of Silence in the mystery category, because a dead signal is not interesting if it happens everywhere. Number 4, Devil's Sea, Pacific Ocean. Everyone knows the Bermuda Triangle. Far fewer people know the Pacific has its own version of a disappearance zone, a region long associated with missing ships, strange conditions, and stories that never seem to settle into a fully satisfying explanation. Off the coast of Japan, in waters sometimes referred to as the Devil's Sea, vessels and aircraft have been linked to disappearances, navigational irregularities, and sudden dangerous conditions. As with all places like this, separating legend from documentable fact is part of the challenge. But that challenge is itself part of the mystery. Because the more stories gather around a place, the harder it becomes to know where folklore ends and anomaly begins. The region sits near complex tectonic and volcanic zones. Underwater volcanic activity, shifting seafloor conditions, powerful currents, rogue waves, storms, and gas releases are all possible contributors to risk. That means there is no shortage of natural mechanisms capable of producing danger. In theory, that should reduce the mystery. Instead, it does something stranger. It multiplies it. Because when a place contains many plausible threats at once, the final explanation for any given disappearance becomes harder to pin down, not easier. Was it a storm, a wave, a mechanical failure, a navigation error, a volcanic event beneath the water, a sudden change in sea state, a chain reaction nobody survived to report? That is the atmosphere surrounding the Devil's Sea. Not one impossible event, but a pattern of unease in a part of the ocean already shaped by geological violence and unpredictable water. The sea is especially good at preserving mystery. A desert may leave debris. A mountain may leave wreckage. The ocean can erase almost everything. It can absorb a ship, scatter fragments across impossible distances, and leave behind only coordinates and speculation. Number 3, Riche Structure, Mauritania. In the Western Sahara, near the town of Ouadane, there is a geological formation so enormous that from the ground it can be difficult to understand what you are standing in. But from above, it becomes one of the most striking shapes on Earth. A vast series of concentric rings etched into the desert, like a giant target or an eye staring back from the stone. It is known as the Richat structure, or the Eye of the Sahara, and from the moment people saw it clearly from the air, it became an obsession. At first, many assumed it had to be an impact crater. The shape seemed too perfect, too circular, too deliberate to be anything else. But the expected shock evidence for a meteor impact was never clearly established in the way that theory required. So geologists turned to another explanation: a deeply eroded geological dome, uplifted and worn down over immense time until its layered structure appeared as concentric rings. That is the leading explanation. And yet even now, the Richat structure remains mysterious in the public imagination because it is one of those places where explanation and appearance are at war with each other. The science says erosion and uplift. The eye says design. The scale makes it even stranger. This is not a small anomaly. It is a formation roughly 25 miles across, large enough to be used by astronauts as a landmark from space. That alone gives it a kind of psychological power. A shape so large it only really becomes legible when you leave the ground. Archaeological evidence shows humans lived in the region long ago, leaving stone tools and traces of occupation around the structure. And that history only adds to the aura. Because once a place looks impossible and ancient people were nearby, speculation begins almost automatically. Atlantis theories have circled the Richat structure for years. Most scientists reject them. But the reason the comparison survives is obvious. The rings look intentional. Number 2, Yonaguni Monument, Japan. Off the coast of Yonaguni Island, at the southwestern edge of Japan, divers found something beneath the water that immediately split opinion. Massive step formations, flat surfaces, sharp angles, terrace-like levels, what looked, to many people, disturbingly like the remains of an underwater structure. The Yonaguni Monument has been debated for years because it sits exactly on the line between geology and archaeology. If it is natural, it is one of the strangest natural rock formations on Earth. If it is artificial, it would imply a human-made site submerged long before conventional timelines would comfortably allow. That is why the argument never really ends. The formation does not behave like a simple mystery with one missing fact. It behaves like a divided interpretation. Two very different stories trying to occupy the same stone. Some geologists argue that the monument is the result of natural fracturing in sandstone and mudstone, combined with erosion and tectonic forces that can produce broad flat plains and striking angular breaks. And that is not unreasonable. Nature can absolutely create geometry that feels architectural, but the counter-argument remains powerful. The site contains features that many observers say look too arranged, too terraced, too intentionally segmented to dismiss easily. Some have pointed to what seem like steps, platforms, and linear corridors. Others argue these are exactly the kinds of shapes human pattern recognition exaggerates in a complex natural formation. That tension is what makes Yonaguni so compelling. It is not just a mystery under the sea, it is a mystery that forces experts into fundamentally different readings of the same object. And underwater settings intensify mystery almost automatically. Light distorts, scale becomes difficult. Surfaces acquire a silence that ruins above ground do not have. Number 1, Nazca Lines, Peru. And now the place that has confused archaeologists, historians, researchers, and ordinary viewers for nearly a century. A giant message in the desert that still has no single explanation everyone agrees on. In southern Peru, across miles of dry reddish ground, the Nazca people created enormous geoglyphs by removing dark surface stones to reveal lighter earth beneath. Some of the designs are simple lines, trapezoids, and spirals. Others are giant animals and figures. A hummingbird, a monkey, a spider, a condor, and a strange humanoid shape often nicknamed the astronaut. The first shock is their size. The second is their perspective. From the ground, many of them are difficult to understand. From the sky, they become clear. And that is where the mystery begins to tighten. How were images of this scale designed with such control by people who had no known access to sustained aerial perspective? Yes, archaeologists have proposed rope and stake methods, grids, and ground planning systems. Those ideas are reasonable. They may explain the mechanics, but for many people, they still do not fully explain the confidence of the designs, because these are not random scratches across the desert. They are composed, coherent, large enough to cross huge stretches of terrain while preserving recognizable form. Then comes the next problem. Why make them? Astronomical calendar? Processional pathways? Water rituals? Messages to deities? Sacred geography? A combination of many functions? There are serious theories, but none has resolved the entire system to universal satisfaction. Some lines align with celestial events. Many do not. Some appear connected to ritual movement. Others seem to exceed any simple ceremonial explanation. That is what has kept the Nazca Lines alive as a mystery rather than a closed archaeological case. We know who made them. We know roughly when they were made. We know the basic technique used to create them. And yet the central question remains astonishingly difficult. Why this? Why here? Why at this scale? Why in forms best appreciated from above? The desert itself amplifies the mystery. The climate is so dry and still that the lines survived for centuries with minimal erosion. That preservation makes them feel less like ruins and more like a signal waiting to be interpreted. And that may be the most unsettling thing about them. The Nazca Lines do not feel accidental. They feel communicative. Not necessarily to aircraft, not necessarily to aliens, not necessarily to anything supernatural, but communicative. As if the people who made them were arranging meaning across the land in a way that depended on distance, scale, and pattern more than ordinary human viewing position. That is why number 1 belongs here. Because the Nazca Lines occupy the most difficult category of mystery. They are not unknown. They are not hidden. They are not newly discovered. They have been studied, mapped, photographed, and debated for generations. And still, the most important part of the story remains unresolved. Not how they were made, but why a civilization decided to mark the Earth on such a scale that the full message would only emerge from a height they could never naturally reach.